Hey, welcome back. I am Gavin, if we've never met, and this is where I love to talk with people like you, leaders of churches, and it's where we help add a little more intention to the mission. Now, if you're new here, I'm really glad you found us. Hope you stick around for a while. And if you've been here before, you know what we do. We get into the real stuff, not just about information. We're going to get to application. So today, I want to talk about something that is about to hit your inbox. And it's not that angry email, it's the mid year giving data. It's hard to believe, but we are almost here at the midway point of 2026, halfway through the year. And when that report hits your inbox, I want to change potentially how you read it. Here's what usually happens. And I know because I was a lead pastor for 13 years. I was a family ministry leader before that for a while, and a pastor before that. And I've been consulting with churches now full time for 5 years. And so I've been in a lot of these conversations, and now I get to lead a lot of these conversations. And so here's what usually happens. The report comes in. Someone on your team, maybe you personally, you look at what came in during the first half of the year and you compare it to what the budget needed, what the expectation was, the plan, and the gap becomes the conversation. Right? The conversation, most of our focus is on the gap. How much are we behind? How much do we cut? Do we need to cut? Or and here's the hard part: how are we going to make it? What needs to happen in Q3, Q4, or all Q4, or all of December? Right? Hope is not a strategy, but that's what we do. That conversation is very natural. And as I said, I get it. I've sat in your seat and I did for a long time. Budgets are real, they're necessary, right? The staff problems and the staff stuff is real. Ministry commitments are real. But I do want to push back on at least one thing. The gap between what actually happened and what your budget, the gap is not the problem. The gap is a symptom. It's kind of like a virus and a symptom. And it's easy sometimes to read the symptom as the virus, but the symptom isn't the problem. It's just a symptom of the problem. So, what you're actually kind of holding when you look at your mid year giving report, it's a diagnostic report of your generosity system. And most pastors do not know how to read that correctly. So, let me start with what kind of a flat or behind giving is actually telling you. Because in your church, you have several different groups of people, right? Or several different, kind of three different ways of doing this. The first, right? The first instinct for most pastors, or at least I think this is the first instinct most pastors have, is that people are just not as generous as they should be. So you look at the gap, again, you think the gap is the problem, you focus on the gap. We should bring in X, we only brought in Y. Look at the gap. The people are the problem, right? And you feel if you preached another stewardship series or made a more compelling appeal, that the numbers would improve, the gap would close, and your focus, as I said, is on the gap, right? Sometimes, yeah, that is partially true, but most of the time, here's what's really happening. Generosity does not plateau because people run out of it. People didn't run out of generosity. It plateaus because churches run out of clarity on how to develop it. That is a different diagnostic, right? It's a different diagnosis. And it leads to a very different solution. When giving is flat, it usually points to really three distinct populations of people that are sitting in your room every Sunday. And we could break this down a little bit more, but I'm just going to break it to three categories. Okay, the first is your non-givers, and we know we have a lot of those. These are the people who have been attending your church, maybe for months, could be even for years. But if you bump into them at a grocery store and you say, "Hey, where do you go to church?" They answer, "Your church." So they're your people. They go to your church. And they've never given, not even really a dollar. Or they have given, but it's like to something that wasn't even really for your church, definitely not operational giving. And it isn't because they're not generous. They probably are to other things, but there just for them is no clear, believable, low pressure first step for someone who has never given to your church. So your church just doesn't have an on ramp for that person. So you know what they do? They sit in the room, they sing the songs, they hear the message, they go home, and the system treats that as normal. Okay, that is not normal, but I'll tell you what it is. It's a design problem. This isn't a gap issue. It's a design, it's a structure, it's a systems problem. Okay, second population of people, let's just call them your middle givers. Again, we could break this down more, and I do that in leadership labs and other places. But there's another big category, just the middle people, right? They're the people who gave last year and they've given some this year, and it's about the same amount. And they're not really disengaged, but they're also not super faithful. They show up, but they also are kind of stuck. They're stagnant in their movement. And the reason they're stuck is almost, or I guess the reason that they are stuck is it's almost never that they don't want to grow in their faith or in their engagement or their generosity or mission connection. It's just that your church is not giving them a next step that makes sense for them at the space that they are in, right? They're hearing the same message, the same appeal, the same invitation as everyone else in the entire church. And stuck people do not need more inspiration. They need a clear pathway. So what are you doing to fix that? Here's the third population. And this is your major donors. Think of these people as your high capacity givers. And this one, I think, surprises pastors a lot, that these individuals are in your room and they have capacity to give significantly, right? They have the inclination to lead generously, and they are getting the exact same communication as the person who walked in for the very first time last week. They're getting the same stewardship email, the same offering appeal, the same event invite, the same everything. And guess what? That's a strategy problem, and it is costing you. Think about it. 3 different populations of people we just listed, 3 different root causes, 1 flat line in your giving report. So what do we do with that, right? Here's what I'd love to give you something very practical for this conversation, because the data is already in your inbox, it's in your hands, or it's about to be, and you're going to be tempted to focus on the gap. I want you to focus on the diagnostic that it's giving you and the systems that could help fix it. So you already have everything you need to diagnose where your generosity system is breaking down. You just need to ask different questions. Here's what I want to do I would love for you to do this before the end of the week, at least before the end of the month, okay? Pull your giving report, and I don't just mean the total line, but the household breakdown. Like most church management systems can easily produce this, right? So you want to look not at individuals, but individual households and their giving history. Now, don't do this by name if you don't want to do that. You can just have an ID number, or it doesn't matter, okay? But once you kind of get this, ask 3 questions as you look at the report. You ready? Question 1, how many households gave for the first time this year? If that number is low, your non-giver on-ramp is probably broken. Okay, you may have like a great offering moment on Sunday. You may have a compelling story to share about what generosity is funding, but you do not have a system that is moving first-time givers towards making a first gift. Those are 2 very different things, okay? So think about this, a moment is not a pathway. So if you have a healthy number of new households showing up this year, but an unhealthy amount of non-givers giving for the first time this year, that's a diagnostic. And the problem is a lack of on-ramps for first-time giving. Okay, question 2, how many households gave more in the first half of this year than they did in the first half of last year? If that number is low, your middle givers have plateaued. And again, they gave, but they stagnated, they stayed. But they didn't grow. Something in your communication, right, might not be hitting them, right? Your pathway isn't working for them. Your discipleship connection is just leaving them exactly in the same place they were 12 months ago. So you got to figure out a pathway for these people. Anytime a person stops moving, they stagnate. And anytime you've seen stagnant water, nothing positive happens when the water stops flowing. So we've got to figure out a pathway solution to speak specifically to them and inspire and equip them to move forward. And third question, who stopped? This is maybe the most overlooked category. Lapsed givers, people who gave consistently at some point and then went away quietly. When that happens, something happened, right? And it could be that they moved, and that's a fair, reason to quit. But it could also be something like a drift in trust, a life change that no one knew about and no one called about. A sense of disconnection from your church that you're not even aware of. Like these people, they're not necessarily gone, but they have drifted away. And you can't fix what you can't name. I mean, those three questions alone, yeah, there are more you can ask, but those, at a bare minimum, those three questions will show you a lot about your system, and it will help highlight if there is a breakdown in the system. And again, not in generalities, in very specific spaces, right? And that's what we're looking for. That is the actual report, by the way. This is the report your mid-year data is trying to tell you if you'll stop focusing on the gap and start looking at something more important. So before we end this conversation, I do want to address something before the final action step, okay? Because I think it trips up a lot of pastors. Like when giving is flat, I think the pastoral instinct is often to focus on spiritual stuff, right? To assume the real problem is a heart issue, that people just need to hear more about generosity, stewardship, the tithe, kingdom investment. And so the response is another series, right? Or another Sunday, set aside to talk about money. And I get it, right? Sometimes that is exactly the right thing to do. And generosity it's absolutely a spiritual issue. Jesus talked about it a lot. So it certainly is something we should talk about. But here's the thing I want you to hear, just as clearly and as kindly, as we can say it. Generosity systems are structural. And that's two very different things, right? A generosity conversation versus a generosity system. So when someone doesn't give for the first time, that is often a design problem, not a heart problem. When a former giver or a giver stays flat for a year, that's not a communication problem, right? It's more than that. When a major donor kind of gets the same stewardship email as the first time attender, listen, that's a strategy problem, not a spiritual conversation. And by the way, you can't pray your way out of a design gap. So the spirituality of generosity is real and it matters deeply. And we should teach on it. We should talk about it. But refusing to look at the structural mechanics of how your church develops givers, that is not something that we should avoid. It's easy to avoid, though, but we can't avoid it. And avoidance does not move your mission forward, right? So you need both. You need spiritual vitality, but you also need structural clarity. And for most of the churches I work with, the structure piece is where the gap actually is. So here's what I'll leave you with to do. You can do it this week, this month, as I said, whatever, as soon as you can. Just pull that household giving level report and answer those 3 questions that I gave you. Write the actual numbers down. Okay, this is not a gut feel thing. We want to have real data, real information. How many first-time givers, gave this year? How many households grew their giving over last year, and how many stopped? Those are your 3 questions. Then gather your lead team, your elders, or your staff, whatever you want to do, and ask one question. Which of these 3 populations has a clear next step in our generosity system right now? And a lot of you may have to say none, and that's okay. This is a diagnostic conversation. And if you do say none, that's your starting point. Pick one of these areas. Don't even worry about the budget right now. Pick one of these areas and don't create a sermon series around it. Just design something for it. If the answer is 1, identify which 2 populations are being left out. Again, this is not a complicated fix. It just takes some good information with kind of clear-eyed diagnostics so that you can now build an intentional design. And you don't need me to tell you, if you don't do anything about this, you know what's going to happen, right? Like the longer you wait to address this as a diagnostic, right? If you kind of read the report as a budget problem and respond with budget solutions, you know what's going to happen, right? The December appeal is going to look exactly like last December's appeal, and you have the same room, the same people, and you're making the same ask. And Q4 is going to have all this weight on it, and maybe it'll bail you out. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't. I mean, I hope it does. But next year, you're going to be in the same place, looking at the gap again, trying to figure out how to talk about it better. And that is not what we're working on, right? It's the system underneath the numbers that has to change. And if it doesn't change, nothing really is ever going to change. So the givers who have capacity to grow, they're just going to plateau again. The first time givers who really never had an on ramp are going to keep sitting in their room and not getting on the journey with you. The same thing is going to keep happening. So the data for you to begin to take action, it is in your hands, right? And it's already telling you something very specific. Please do not wait for Q3 or Q4 to figure out what it's saying. Diagnose it now, right? And do something about it today. Last thing, if this conversation struck a nerve or was helpful or whatever, I first of all, I'd just love for you to share it with other pastors that are in your network or other friends that may be looking at mid-year giving right now and having this conversation. I have an entire blog I've written about this. If you just go to my site, gavinadams.com, you can read it there. And last thing, if you're at a place where you want to think a little more strategically about generosity, this is one of the spaces I work in the most because it's one of the biggest opportunities in local churches. So reach out to me directly. My email, gavin@gavinadams.com. I read every email personally, okay? So I will respond to you directly, and I would love to have that conversation. Until next time, see you soon.